In the winter of 2025, a single wedding photograph entered the climate-controlled vaults of a regional archive in Ohio, absorbed quietly among probate files and dissolved estate inventories. It arrived without ceremony, boxed with deeds, ledgers, and brittle correspondence from a family line that had simply ended. The label was neat, practiced, and unremarkable. Eleanor Brooks and Silas Winfield. Wedding portrait, 1879. For more than a century, the image had been passed down as evidence of stability. Two figures preserved at the precise moment respectability was achieved. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The photograph itself was typical of the period. Painted columns rose behind the couple, flanked by heavy drapery meant to suggest wealth and permanence. Eleanor Brooks stood on the left, corseted and formal, her dress a disciplined architecture of lace and fabric. Silas Winfield stood beside her in dark wool, his expression set in the practiced neutrality of a man being documented rather than celebrated. Nothing in the composition drew attention. Nothing at first glance demanded interpretation. It was catalogued without comment. The unease came later, quietly, without any single flaw to blame. An archivist, reviewing the image weeks afterward during routine digitization, paused longer than necessary. Not because of damage, not because of provenance, but because the photograph refused to settle into memory. There was no obvious irregularity, no grotesque detail, no visible mark of scandal. And yet, the longer it remained on the screen, the more it resisted the familiar language of marital portraiture. Eleanor's posture was perfect, too perfect. Her shoulders were squared with an effort that felt sustained rather than posed, as though collapse had been delayed for the duration of the exposure. The stiffness was not ceremonial. It was defensive. Silas, meanwhile, stood angled away from her. The separation between their bodies was slight, measured in inches, but unmistakably deliberate. In most photographs of the era, couples leaned together out of necessity, supports hidden beneath sleeves, shared weight during long exposure times. Here, there was space, preserved space, a gap no photographer would have corrected. The archivist could not explain why it mattered, only that it did. When the image was magnified, the illusion of composure deteriorated further. Eleanor's hands, folded around a bouquet arranged with almost clinical symmetry, were not still. The edges blurred faintly under enlargement, revealing motion where none should exist. Tremor. Continuous, restrained movement. Her knuckles pressed white through lace gloves, never intended to conceal strain. Her eyes told a similar story. Swollen at the edges, irritated. Not the glassy severity of long exposure, but the aftermath of sustained crying. This was not the solemnity of the era. It was endurance. The photograph had not captured a union. It had captured containment. There were no notes attached to explain it. No marginalia. No dissenting account. The official record described a respectable marriage between two families of compatible standing. Railroad investments, land deeds, social continuity, everything the late 19th century demanded from its daughters. And yet the image told a quieter truth, one that had survived because no one had bothered to erase it. The photographer had not corrected the distance, had not adjusted the angle, had not demanded affection where none existed. He had simply documented what stood before him. A woman holding herself together. A man already elsewhere. The archive had accepted the photograph for what it claimed to be. History often does. But photographs are not obedient documents. They retain what words are designed to smooth over. They preserve tension. They remember what families forget. And once seen clearly, this one could not be unseen. At first, the archivist offered a reasonable interpretation, one that fit comfortably within the language of late 19th century restraint. Victorian weddings, after all, were not performances of affection. They were contracts. Long exposures required rigidity. Emotional distance, particularly among upper-middle families, was neither rare nor remarked upon. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. This explanation was entered quietly into the internal notes. Probable formality, exaggerated by exposure time. The archive did not flag the image. It did not circulate for review. It rested, as so many artifacts do, beneath an assumption that the past must be understood on its own terms, and that discomfort was often the fault of modern eyes. But the explanation began to fail almost immediately. The archivist, trained to distrust instinct, yet guided by it daily, returned to the portrait repeatedly, not to the couple's faces, but to the geometry of the frame. The distance between Eleanor and Silas was not symmetrical. It had been preserved deliberately. The backdrop's column, meant to suggest unity and stability, cut visually between them like a partition. This was not incidental staging. The photographer had allowed separation to dominate the composition. If it were modesty, there would have been balance. If it were convention, there would have been alignment. Instead, there was avoidance. Seeking context, the archivist pulled county marriage records from 1879. The entry for Eleanor Brooks and Silas Winfield was unremarkable. Date correct. Witnesses appropriate. No objections filed. The Brooks family appeared solvent at the time of record. Land holdings intact, tax payments current. The Winfields were similarly positioned. Emerging industrial capital tied to rail expansion and milling contracts. On paper, the match was ideal. Too ideal. The next step was correspondence. Estate donations often carried fragments, letters never meant to survive beyond their relevance. Buried in a folder miscategorized under household accounts was a thin stack of personal notes written in Eleanor's hand. They were undated, unsent, and folded until the paper fibers had weakened. They were not addressed to Silas. The tone was restrained but intimate, written to a man identified only as J. The language suggested familiarity formed over time. Shared walks, shared books. Future tense, spoken with caution but confidence. One line, written and then crossed through, read, "I had hoped choice might still belong to me." The archivist paused there. There was no scandal in this alone. Engagements dissolved. Attachments were redirected. Families intervened. History allowed for such corrections. But the timing was wrong. The letters ended abruptly in early 1878. Eleanor's marriage occurred the following spring. There was no gradual transition, no emotional pivot, just silence. The archivist searched for J school rosters from neighboring towns revealed a Jonathan Miller, employed as a school teacher less than 12 miles from the Brooks home during that same period. Census data placed him within Eleanor's social proximity, but outside her class mobility, educated, respectable, but financially vulnerable. His records ended suddenly in late 1878. He did not marry. He relocated west within the year. The accepted narrative would suggest heartbreak, perhaps ambition, perhaps incompatibility. But photographs do not record what might have happened. They record what did. And what this photograph preserved was not resignation, but strain, not sorrow, but pressure. Eleanor's body bore the marks of endurance, not decision. Silas's posture was not that of a groom bound by duty, but of a man positioned beside an outcome already negotiated. The archivist made no claims yet, only annotations, only cross-references, only a quiet recognition that the official version of this marriage explained nothing the image insisted upon. The past had provided a story that fit the ledger. The photograph had refused to comply. The archive's digitization software was never meant to interrogate emotion. It existed to preserve, to stabilize, to flatten objects into reference. But when the wedding portrait was scanned at full resolution, the technology did what historians often cannot. It removed the comfort of distance. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. At high magnification, The photograph ceased to behave. The edges softened where they should have remained crisp. Fine details, lace, glove seams, bouquet stems, revealed inconsistencies that could not be attributed to age or damage. Eleanor's bouquet, arranged tightly against her bodice, showed faint directional blur, not downward, not lateral, but rhythmic. Small, repeated movements, arrested mid-action, trembling. The archivist isolated Eleanor's hands and overlaid exposure data from similar studio portraits of the era. The comparison was immediate. Where other brides' hands appeared rigid, even sculptural, Eleanor's bore micro-distortions, consistent with sustained muscular strain. She had not shifted once. She had fought movement continuously. Her face told the rest. The swelling around her eyes was asymmetrical, heavier beneath the left lid. Tear irritation, prolonged rather than recent. The skin around her nose showed faint discoloration, the residue of repeated wiping. These were not the marks of a woman who had cried earlier in the day. They belonged to someone who had not stopped. The archivist enlarged Silas Winfield next. His expression, previously read as neutral, fractured under scrutiny. His jaw was set, but not clenched, held. His shoulders angled subtly backward, as though resisting proximity rather than unaware of it. Most telling was his gaze. It did not align with the lens. He looked past it, unfocused, already detached from the moment he was meant to inhabit. This was not indifference. It was avoidance. The archivist documented each anomaly carefully. Motion blur, muscular tension, eye inflammation, compositional separation. None were decisive alone. Together they formed a pattern that contradicted the photograph's intended purpose. The image did not depict a beginning. It documented a concession. The next discovery came from the negative itself. Studio marks along the lower edge revealed that the photographer had taken multiple exposures. Only one survived in the family archive. The others, presumably discarded, were never catalogued. But the spacing between marks suggested adjustments had been made. Repositioning attempts, perhaps instruction. The archivist imagined the unseen moments between exposures. The photographer asking Eleanor to remain still, asking Silas to step closer. The pause, the refusal, spoken or otherwise. The eventual decision to capture what could not be corrected. Photographers of the era were craftsmen, but they were also witnesses. They knew when to insist and when resistance would only deepen what already existed. This one had chosen preservation over fabrication. The archivist searched for the photographer's name. He had operated briefly in the region, less than 5 years. His other surviving portraits were competent but unremarkable, except for one pattern. Couples were often positioned with visible space between them. Not scandalous distance, just enough to acknowledge reality. A man who did not correct discomfort. The final detail emerged from Eleanor's posture. Her spine was unnaturally straight, unsupported by visible props. Brides were often discreetly braced to prevent collapse during long exposure times. No such support was present here. Eleanor held herself upright alone. The archivist noted this last, hand hovering over the keyboard. What the photograph captured was not a woman standing beside her husband. It was a woman holding herself together while something irrevocable settled into place. The record had called it marriage. The image had recorded containment. And somewhere between the shutters opening and closing, the truth had entered the frame, uninvited, undeniable, and preserved precisely because no one thought to look for it. The image could no longer be examined alone. Once the physical strain embedded in the photograph became undeniable, the archivist turned away from the frame and into the paper trail that had been trusted for generations. If the portrait showed containment, the records would explain what required it. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. County ledgers from the late 1870s revealed a sudden instability in the Brooks family finances, one that had been smoothed over in public memory. In 1877, Eleanor's father, Thomas Brooks, had invested heavily in a regional railroad expansion project that promised unprecedented returns. The venture collapsed within 18 months. Court filings showed deferred payments. Property tax records reflected extensions quietly granted. By early 1878, the Brooks estate was no longer secure. This context alone explained urgency. It did not explain Eleanor. The archivist reconstructed Eleanor Brooks's final year before marriage through fragments: church attendance logs, school committee minutes, private correspondence preserved by accident rather than intention. She had been engaged, not rumored, not speculated. Formally engaged. Jonathan Miller, schoolteacher. The engagement was announced in a local paper in late 1877, then quietly withdrawn without explanation the following spring. No scandal was printed. No illness cited. Simply an absence where certainty had been. Jonathan's letters, preserved in a different archive nearly 50 miles away, confirmed the timeline. His tone shifted sharply in early 1878, from anticipation to confusion, then to something closer to resignation. One line stood out. "Your silence has been explained to me by others, though not by you." The archivist sat with that sentence longer than necessary. Silas Winfield entered the picture abruptly. Winfield records showed aggressive acquisition during the same period. Land parcels absorbed, debts consolidated, industrial contracts secured with speed that suggested opportunity rather than patience. He was not a romantic figure. He was a consolidator, a man who understood leverage and timing. The Brooks family's debts disappeared from court records less than 2 months before Eleanor's wedding. The transaction itself was never recorded as such. It did not need to be. Debt forgiveness appeared as settlement. Property transfers were routed through intermediaries. No single document accused itself. But correspondence between Thomas Brooks and Silas Winfield, preserved unintentionally among business papers, confirmed what the public record refused to say plainly. The language was transactional, stripped of sentiment. Phrases like arrangement secured and family stability restored appeared repeatedly. Eleanor's name was absent, her role assumed. Consent was not discussed. It was unnecessary. The archivist reconstructed the final weeks before the wedding through absence. Eleanor withdrew from social events. She stopped writing altogether. Her name appeared less frequently in church records. She attended rehearsals. She complied. When the wedding day arrived, there was no celebration recorded beyond obligation. No diary entry described joy. No letter spoke of hope. Only the photograph remained, silent, resisting interpretation until forced into it. The tragedy was not a single moment. It was procedural. Eleanor had not been chosen. She had been transferred. The photograph now read differently. Her rigid spine was no longer symbolic. It was literal resistance, held in check. Silas's distance was not indifference. It was acknowledgement of a transaction already completed elsewhere. The gap between them was not emotional. It was contractual. What the archive had preserved as respectability was, in fact, evidence of collapse, of a young woman's future rerouted without ceremony, without protest allowed to surface. The marriage did not shatter Eleanor's life immediately. It did something worse. It sealed it. And the photograph, never meant to accuse, had waited nearly a century and a half for someone to recognize that it was not documenting a beginning, but the precise instant when something else ended. The deeper the archivist moved into private correspondence, the more the wedding portrait ceased to function as a personal artifact and began to resemble a ledger entry, one sealed not with ink, but with a human life. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The letters between Thomas Brooks and Silas Winfield were not hidden. They had simply never been read as anything but business. Written on heavy paper, folded crisply, filed without sentiment, they documented negotiations that unfolded with alarming speed in the winter of 1878. Debt figures were itemized, deadlines emphasized, railroad losses discussed with language bordering on panic. Brooks did not plead, he proposed. Winfield responded with precision. He outlined conditions in careful, impersonal prose. Financial relief could be arranged. Creditors would be absorbed. Property seizure avoided. The Brooks name preserved. But urgency dominated every exchange. The arrangement needed to be concluded quickly, before outside parties became aware of the family's vulnerability. Only once did Eleanor appear in these letters, and then only indirectly. Winfield referred to the domestic consolidation as a stabilizing gesture, one that would bind interests permanently and remove uncertainty. Brooks acknowledged this with gratitude, writing that the solution would secure my daughter's future while restoring the family's position. There was no inquiry into Eleanor's wishes, no suggestion that refusal was possible. Her role was assumed as naturally as collateral. The archivist noted how often the word necessary appeared. Necessary to move quickly. Necessary to maintain appearances. Necessary to prevent speculation. The wedding date was advanced abruptly. Invitations were issued late. Preparations were compressed into weeks. The haste was visible even in secondary records. Rush tailoring receipts, expedited church bookings, hurried legal filings. Everything about the marriage suggested containment of risk rather than celebration. What emerged most clearly from the correspondence was Winfield's detachment. He did not write as a groom. He wrote as a stabilizer, a man consolidating assets, neutralizing liabilities, absorbing a family on the brink of public exposure. His tone was calm, almost clinical. Brooks, by contrast, wrote with strain visible beneath formality. His letters grew shorter, his gratitude more pronounced. In one, he referred to the arrangement as the only remaining course consistent with dignity. Dignity, for whom, the archivist wondered. Eleanor's voice was absent entirely during this period. No letters in her hand survived from the months leading to the wedding. The silence was not accidental. It was enforced by circumstance. The archivist found evidence of Eleanor remaining in the household, her movements reduced, her presence managed. She was not consulted. She was prepared. The marriage, as it appeared in public record, resolved the Brooks family crisis neatly. Debts vanished, land remained intact, social standing stabilized. Winfield gained influence, property access, and a respectable alliance that masked the transactional nature of the union. The cost was not recorded. The photograph now appeared not as a portrait of two individuals, but as documentation of compliance. Eleanor's trembling hands, once examined as emotional residue, now read as the body's response to inevitability. Silas's distance was no longer mysterious. It was procedural. He was present because presence was required, not because intimacy was intended. The archivist added a final note to the file. Marriage executed under financial duress. Consent unexamined. It was the most accurate language available. History often frames such unions as pragmatic solutions to temporary problems. But the correspondence made clear that this marriage did not solve a crisis. It transferred it. The instability was absorbed into Eleanor's life, sealed behind lace and legal formality. The wedding portrait endured because it succeeded in its public task. It showed order, respectability, continuity. What it failed to hide, what it never could, was the quiet violence of a decision made without the person most affected ever being allowed to speak. The final layer did not emerge from financial records or public correspondence. It surfaced where families rarely expect history to look, in sealed letters marked personal, never meant for preservation, never intended to be read by anyone beyond their immediate recipients. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The archivist found them bound together with a faded ribbon, stored separately from the Brooks and Winfield collections, misfiled under medical receipts. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. The recipient was not Silas. It was a physician in Cincinnati, consulted privately in the weeks before the wedding. The letters were cautious, written with a restraint that bordered on fear. Eleanor described symptoms without naming their cause: missed cycles, exhaustion, nausea that arrived each morning with mechanical precision. She asked not for confirmation, but for discretion. "I cannot be known," she wrote. "I cannot be delayed." The physician's reply was brief and unambiguous. Eleanor was with child. The conception date aligned not with Silas Winfield, but with Jonathan Miller. The archivist stopped reading for several minutes. A second set of letters, these written in Silas Winfield's hand, completed the picture. Addressed to Thomas Brooks, they acknowledged what had been discovered and what would be required to proceed. The language was careful, precise, and devoid of moral reaction. Winfield knew. He agreed to the marriage regardless. But the terms changed. Additional land was transferred quietly. Business shares adjusted. A separate trust was established under an intermediary's name. Winfield's acceptance was conditional, not compassionate. The child would not be acknowledged. The timing would need to appear plausible. Arrangements would be made. The marriage did not conceal scandal. It absorbed it. Records showed Eleanor sent away late in her pregnancy under the pretense of nervous exhaustion. She stayed with distant relations whose names appeared nowhere else in the archive. No birth announcement followed. No death record surfaced. The child did not exist on paper, but traces remained. A physician's invoice dated 9 months after the wedding listed postpartum care. A nurse was paid for 3 weeks, then dismissed. A payment was issued to a rural boarding household for infant accommodation, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in Winfield's records. After that, nothing. The child vanished completely. Within a year of the birth, Eleanor and Silas were no longer living together. Property records showed separate residences maintained discreetly. Social appearances ceased. They did not divorce. Divorce would have invited questions. Instead, they lived parallel lives bound only by legal necessity. Eleanor's later correspondence revealed what the archive could not quantify. She never wrote of her child directly, but her actions spoke clearly. She donated anonymously to women's aid societies. She financed discreet travel for young women facing circumstances. She appeared repeatedly in the margins of records involving coerced marriages and sudden relocations. She could not reclaim what had been taken, but she could recognize it in others. Silas Winfield, meanwhile, rose publicly. His reputation solidified, his wealth expanded, yet his personal correspondence thinned until it disappeared entirely. He died years later, attended formally, spoken of respectfully, and buried alone. Eleanor and Silas were interred in separate plots. The archivist closed the final folder with care. The wedding portrait no longer represented mystery. It represented knowledge, knowledge deliberately buried, but imperfectly. Eleanor's trembling hands were not fear of marriage. They were the body's response to erasure already underway. Silas's distance was not emotional coldness. It was acknowledgement of a transaction that required forgetting. The child's absence was the core truth the archive had tried hardest to deny. And yet the photograph endured, preserving the only moment when the lie had not yet fully settled, when strain, resistance, and unspoken truth still surfaced in the frame. The official version had survived for nearly a century and a half, but it had never been complete. When the archivist completed the file, there was no formal conclusion to write, no recommendation for reclassification, no declaration of fraud. The record had done what records always do. It stopped short of accusation and allowed silence to resume its authority. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The wedding portrait was returned to storage with a revised description that changed almost nothing. Names remained, date remained. The word marriage was not removed. Archives are conservative by design. They preserve what can be proven and contain what cannot. What Eleanor Brooks endured belonged to the latter category. And yet, the image could no longer be seen innocently. It stood now as a document of containment, rather than celebration, a frozen moment when a lie was still unstable. The archivist understood this instinctively. Photographs taken after that day would not show strain. They would show composure. The body learns when resistance is futile. It adapts. It survives by smoothing its surface. This photograph had caught Eleanor before that adaptation was complete. The distance between her and Silas was no longer symbolic. It was diagnostic. It marked the boundary between public narrative and private erasure, a marriage that existed on paper but never in shared life, a child removed so thoroughly that even absence became normalized. History would not indict Thomas Brooks. It would not condemn Silas Winfield. It would not record the child's name because it never had one to record. What remained instead was the aftermath, quiet, procedural, and devastating in its efficiency. Eleanor's later life unfolded without spectacle. She never reclaimed what was taken from her. She never corrected the record. Correction would have required exposure, and exposure would have destroyed the very women she later worked to protect. Her aid was discreet, her influence invisible. She moved through the margins, where history rarely bothers to look. Silas's legacy was simpler. His achievements were listed. His wealth counted. His isolation explained away as temperament. When he died, the papers called him reserved. They did not call him what he was, a man who understood the cost of silence and paid it willingly. They were buried apart. The archivist visited the cemetery once, out of habit more than duty. Eleanor's marker was modest, her name unadorned, no reference to marriage, no children listed beneath it. Silas's grave stood elsewhere, larger, better maintained, equally silent. The photograph remained the only place where the truth surfaced without being asked to justify itself. No court had challenged the marriage, no church had questioned the arrangement, no ledger had recorded the child's removal as anything other than necessary. And so, the injustice endured, not as scandal, but as respectability. That was the most disturbing realization of all. Nothing about Eleanor's story required conspiracy, no secret society, no falsified document. It required only compliance, urgency, and the shared agreement that certain sacrifices were acceptable if made quietly enough. The photograph had survived because it was never considered dangerous. It showed no violence, no crime. Just a man and a woman standing where they were told to stand. But history's most enduring injuries rarely announce themselves. They are archived politely, labeled correctly, and passed down as examples of order. 146 years later, the image no longer functioned as a wedding portrait. It functioned as evidence, not of wrongdoing that could be prosecuted, but of a truth that could be recognized too late to repair. A record of a life rerouted, a child erased, and a society that required neither explanation nor apology. The official version still exists, but the photograph remembers something else, and it will continue to remember long after the names attached to it fade, because it captured the moment when the lie was not yet fully believed, and the cost of survival was still visible in the body of the woman asked to bear it.